Okay, so we had a choice for a coffee break, but I said no because I think the last talk will be rather invigorating. So we decided to continue. I hope you all have the energy left. There is going to be coffee, don't worry about that. Our next speaker is better known as RTDP, Ratnadeep, but he's also been in the Ruby community for a long time, and he also refers to himself as RTDP. All right. I've heard him give a talk in RubyConf with everything from vernacular coding in Hindi, Marathi, stuff like this. This time, I think he's going to go and give a completely different perspective to how we have to approach things, especially Rails. And I took a lot of inspiration from his sticker, which says, "Life has no control Z." All yours.
Thank you. Am I audible? Okay. Hi everyone. Dissecting Rails, a different approach to learning the Rails. That's the topic of my talk. I am Ratnadeep Deshmane, mainly known as RTDP. You can find me on Twitter as RTDP. I have some Ruby stickers. I am also the founder of a company called BetaCraft. You have seen our logos around. So if you need Ruby stickers, meet me. I used to be a digital nomad and used to travel a lot of places. So every time I used to come at the conference, I used to come with the pictures to show. This time there are no new pictures. These are all old pictures. I'm ex-nomad because I got married, right? So now I'm just in Pune. Ruby Varnak is one of the open source projects that I have, exactly the same thing that Gautam mentioned. So I gave the first talk about the Ruby Varnak back in 2014 and 2015. And this is what it was back then. There were some Marathi Ruby, then there was some Hindi Ruby. All these are working code. And then some of my team members also contributed Malayalam and Tamil versions of the Ruby as well. So now there are gems for Ruby Malayalam and Ruby Tamil as well, okay? And then I gave some of the talks at other conferences, and now I also have Ruby Varnak Thai and Ruby Varnak Spanish as well, okay? The reason this project exists is because of teaching. It becomes so easy to teach, it becomes so entertaining to teach, and it becomes so fun to teach when you can code in your own native language, right? So here is a code that's written in Hindi, and you can take so much liberty with the examples that you can create. It doesn't have to be foobar. It can be anything that you want. Very, very close to the jokes that you do in your daily life, right? So that's the reason. So if you want to know more about this, we can talk after the thing. And then it doesn't always have to be about learning. It can be fun too. So here is an example. This is Ruby Varnak emoji. This is entire code written in emojis. It's a valid Ruby code. You can execute that. You can see at the bottom. It actually does print. So the speaker is the print, by the way. And yeah. Okay. So coming to the topic, dissecting Rails, we are just going to talk about three things. Why it matters, why you should know about it, and how it's going to help, right? In the how section, we are going to see how can you do that, how can you dissect the Rails, and the main thing that I will try to cover in there is how simple it is. It's not as complex as you would think, right? And in the what next, if I convince you why it's required and how you can do it, in the what next, I will have some slides and code samples or exercises for you to take away and then try at home. So just these three things, and then the conference is over, you can go home. So only 242 slides to go, yeah? I'm not sure how many of you know him, but he's Tender Love. He's a Ruby core team and also the Rails core team. As I will be giving this talk for you and explaining all these things, what I want out of this talk for me is someday be a presenter like him. I'm not as smart as him, I know that, right? But I have a simpler goal for me, which is to be as funny as him, right? So that's my target. And you can help in that. So if I make jokes, please laugh, okay? And I was talking with my team. I was asking them if they have any jokes that I can include in my slides and everything. They did not have anything. But I wanted to make sure that they contribute. So what we have decided is, if there is a joke, and then I do this sign, that means it's a joke, and they need to laugh. So let's see how that goes, okay? Just a side thing. So Why Love Ruby is one of the Rails application that I had made some 10, 11, 12 years back, which is open source. So anyone who wants to contribute to a very simple Rails application, you can do that. And this site, whyloveruby.com, is a place where you can go and share your reason to love the Ruby. And obviously the most voted answer on that site, why someone loves Ruby, is about the community. So thank you everyone for being such a great community. I'm sure we have so many first-time speakers, so many first-time attendees here, and they would see what it means to be in this community and how open everyone is, right? Okay, so coming to the main point, dissecting Rails, why? So we will go through this. So the Rails now is more than 18 years old, and what has happened is if you were someone who started Rails back in 2009-10, like when I did, then it didn't have that big of a feature set, or it didn't have that many of a features in it, right? But then if today you're trying to learn the Rails, there are so many features, there are so many tasks that Rails handles for you that the entire public area becomes, or public API area becomes so huge that it's a little challenging to learn Rails. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why this dissecting is a good idea, right? The other newcomer problems that I have seen is it's hard for people to understand where Ruby stops and where Rails starts, right? So if, on the Rails doc time, there is an article that says Rails is omakase, right? And then if you consider Rails as a recipe that you are trying to eat and you love the taste of it, what happens is it has so many ingredients, but because of its own masalas and stuff, you never know the taste of the ingredients, right? So the idea here is to take those ingredients out, and without the Rails masala, test them and see if it feels better. The other thing I have seen with the newcomers is understanding the modules and their independence, right? We will be touching upon this a bit later as well. The other problem that I have seen is for mid-level developers who are trying to skill up in the Rails world. In this, what I have seen is 0 to 1 is easy, but 1 to 2 is hard. And what I mean by that is you are someone who have good introduction with the Ruby syntax and how to write a working code and how to solve the simple problems, or sometimes write the algorithms, right? But then you want to take that next step where you want to take or lead a team, design, architect, right? Or solve some of the challenging problems, performance issues, modularity issues, right? So in that case, this dissecting exercise will help you skill up a bit faster on the Rails side, right? So taking on bigger challenges, I was saying, that's one of the reasons why you should consider it. And coming to the next one, what we have is a modularity, and I will tell why it's important, right? These are like shiny toys. How many here are bikers? Okay. Oh, that's big number, right? So in life you have like two stages. In the stage one, you like these kind of a shiny toys, but you don't necessarily have the money to buy it. And then there is a second stage where you don't have a permission to buy it. So I'm sure some of the married men here will understand, right? So now the reason I'm showing this bike is look at how manufacturing of this bike, the engineering of these bikes is done in a modular way. When a headlamp of a bike gets faulty, you don't have to replace the entire set there. You can just simply replace the bulb. You can add any other bulb. So as long as that bulb fits into the holder and screws there and takes in the current, you can even play around with voltages and wattages as well. But as long as the interface, which is that holder, is correct, you can use any bulb you want, right? So that's the idea. And then it doesn't just stop at there. You can see in this bike that there is so much more that you can change and modify everywhere, right? You can have different tires, you can have different wheels, silencer, the handlebars, the seats, everything, right? So what's happening here is there is one chassis, on that sits one engine, and all these components are assembled on top of that central chassis, right? So that's the idea, that's the modularity. What I would suggest people to do sometimes is look around some of the nicely crafted mechanical elements and just stare at them for 30 minutes and appreciate how things are modular and how well they are assembled, right? And then this design also has one benefit that you can accessorize it. So it's an open to extension, right? It can be extended as an how you want and styles that you want, right? So think of your code, whether how much of it is extendable, yeah? And then once you think about that, look at your code, come back and see what kind of a bike your code looks like. Is it the first bike which is simple, minimalistic, very readable, or is it the second type wherein, I would like to take some time to figure that out. Which category is it falling in, right? Or suppose you are a mechanic who wants to work on a machine, and these two bikes come at you with a problem. Which one would you touch first, right? So that's the thing. Okay, so basically, if you are a Rails developer who is trying to learn Rails, this is Dissecting is an exercise that is something that you should consider. You want to upskill yourself in the Rails world, this is something that you want to consider. And then the third is, if you want to understand how the modularity is there in the Rails, then again, this is an exercise that you should consider. I hope you got that Zinda Houtum vibe there, right? I hope you have convinced why we should be doing this, because I don't have any more slides on the why section. Moving to Dissecting Rails, how, okay. Now, if this entire Dissecting Rails and learning the Rails in this way, if this were to be a course, it would be at least 20 hours of a course to go through each and everything and explain how things are coming together and whatnot. But here, what we are going to do is, it's not a movie, it's going to be a trailer. So I will be showing you some of the examples or some of the components or modules of the Rails, and then showing you a single slide enough code showing how easy it is to use that outside of the Rails. So that's the target that we have. So let's run. Now, when it comes to learning the Rails, there are some people who learned Ruby first and then went to the Rails, and then there are some who learned Ruby on Rails as a framework directly, right? How many of you know this book? It's back from 2009-10 when the Rails came out, right? And how many of you have learned Ruby on Rails with Rails being the first thing, and then maybe caught up on the Ruby, right? Oh, that's more than I expected. That was actually the same thing for me as well. So I went to a mentor who was doing the Ruby on Rails and thought like I should be doing this as well while I was doing some hobby web applications and whatnot, right? And then it was a very painful path. I learned the Rails first. I thought that's what the Ruby is. And then I could build applications. The code used to work. It even went to the production. But then when time came to fix the issues, extend things, modularize things, that's when you hit the roadblock. And that's why I think anyone who starts, they need to make sure that the basics are covered first and then move into the Rails. So knowing the Ruby well, knowing the bundler well, and knowing the rake well is something I consider as a basic things that one needs to understand. What I've seen is, because these are ingredients that are used in the Rails, it commonly happens that people just consider these as a part of the Rails as well, which is not the case, right? And then the other downside is that sometimes you don't even appreciate or understand how much more important and essential these components are, right? So for example, bundler. There was a time when it was running with 2.3 and then there was nothing called bundler. And then what you had to do was have an environment file and mention all the gems that you use with all the versions that you use, and then getting a new Rails application onto your machine and installing that. What that meant is doing the gem install for all the gems with their version number mentioned. And then sometimes you will have 2 Rails applications on a single machine with 2 different versions, and it used to get very, very complex. So what I would challenge you to do is write any of the application outside of the Rails maybe without using the bundler and see how hard it gets. The same thing for the rake. So very recently what also happened is rake db migrate, the commands like that which were present in the Rails, they were shifted to Rails db migrate. So now the underneath, it's the rake that's doing the job, but from the top you don't even have that view. You're thinking that it's a Rails specific command that's doing the job. So that's why it's important. Moving to the next one is the essential part I would call is a rack. And here is a good diagram explaining where the rack sits and why it's important. So in this stack, you have a browser. Then the request goes to the server. Now the server could be anything that supports rack applications, which could be Unicorn, Puma, or anything else, right? And then we have that rack, and then behind that we have a Rails. So rack is just an interface that's defined about how the request and the response data should be exchanged. And then it's also a gem that shows how and what can be done and how it's done, right? And then in this world, in the Ruby world, more of, it's not just the Rails that using the rack. What you can do is you can build web applications just with the rack, or you can even go and explore something like a Sinatra or Hanami, which are the other frameworks which are quite minimalistic, right? So here is a very simple example of what it means to have a rack application which takes something in and just responds with a hello world. Like as small as 3 lines, and you have a web application running. And here is another example of a simple rack app which is trying to do something useful. So there are 2 endpoints that it's handling. One is a verify keynote on the line number 8, and another is a root path which is on the line number 10. And then it's also handling all the 404s if someone types any other paths apart from this, right? So it's that easy. From rack, the next thing to learn is the middlewares. And this is also a common thing that one would think, oh, is it not too much Railsy thing? It's not. It's too much of a rack thing, actually, right? And the way it comes into the picture is all those Sentry or APM performance monitoring and applications that you do, those depend on the middleware to monitor the applications and their requests. The next thing to look into and understand is the active support, wherein, like here is a sample. So which one you think are the part of active support method calls versus non-active support method calls, right? This is also something very, very confusing for a lot of people who are way too much into the Rails world, and then when they put the Rails aside and try to write their first Ruby script, they go like, oh, why is this method which used to work without an issue not working anymore, right? And those are the things like time now dot beginning of month dot end of the day and whatnot. Yeah, and it applies to many other Ruby classes as well, like strings, hash, right? It would be a bit of point of contention or a discussion as well that should there be so much of changes to the classes that are already written by some other library and adding things onto top of it. But it's being done and it's working good. Yeah? Same thing with the blank. That also brings us to another method, which is array.42, which has a story of itself, wherein what had happened was when the initial couple of versions of the Rails has active support, and it added so many functions to the native classes of the Ruby. It had functions like array.second to array.third until array.99. And the motive behind that was it made easier to look into the objects that are present in the array. And then it was like a lot of backlash that how Ruby is adding, or Rails is particularly adding too much methods and making things slow and not optimized, right? So with that, all those methods had to be taken out. What remained was array.second to array.ninth, just those. And then the other one method that DHS decided to keep was this array.42. So you do have that. Moving to the next one, which is the active record. So here is a one simple code that is outside the Rails. It's a simple one-line script, and it's an active record. So you just require it. You do establish the connection in maybe 2 lines, 3 lines, or it could even be a single line, and then define a class which is a class of active record base. So as long as your table has your database has a table called users, you're good. You start creating the users, counting them first, and even the querying them. It's that simple to use the active record outside of Rails. Next is the active model. Again, similar story. I just included active model, and I have some of the features available from it. And in terms of the active model, it's quite modular as well. For example, you are writing some classes which needs to have a callbacks, or there are some dirty checks, or there are some validations, naming, translation, serialization, a lot of things. All those can be picked from the Rails and used outside in your very specific Ruby applications. Next is action mailer, right? And here is a single line method or a single slide code to use the action mirror in real. So for example, what we are doing here is requiring another gem called as a letter opener, and then using letter opener as the delivery method, and then it's simply a class called as invitation mailer, which is a subclass of action mailer base. So this is a line that you commonly see in a lot of Rails applications, and then send that email. Simple enough. And it just doesn't have to be with simple text which is being sent in the emails. It can also be being picked and sent from the various folders as well. So for example, here there is a folder called as views invitation mailer notify with template.html, right? So as long as you are following that convention, your HTML files can remain in that folder and being sent with just this code as well. Next is ERB templating. So in the Rails world, what happens is the ERB templating is also something that becomes very complex to pull out and understand separately. So in that MVC architecture, what's happening is your request is coming through the routers to your controller, and then you're, let's say, pulling some data from the models, and then your views are getting rendered, and by default, let's say it's an ERB files. So how that data is flowing and how that ERB templating is generating, and what all those libraries that are contributing to the various things that are happening in that single requests lifecycle is complex. But what we can instead do is render some ERB templates. So as you can see here, there is a file, if you check the line number 8 here, which is notification mail.erb. And we are just reading that file and then calling erb.new, fetching that file in, and then as soon as we call .result by passing the binding to it, our template gets rendered. Yeah? So it's that simple to do the templating. Now, as we were talking through all these examples, there are a couple of exceptions as well, right? And here are some of the exceptions. So for these ones, you can't have like a one slide code base to understand them. You will just have to be more specific. You will have to maybe write some complex code to get some stuff, usable stuff done with these gems. So these are some of the things that better be learned within the Rails. Yeah? And then the dissecting of the Rails is not just specific to the components that are inside the Rails. I feel that it's very essential that it also gets applied towards some of the ideas that are used in the Rails world. And what are some of those ideas? For example, DSLs in Ruby. This is one of the things that I have seen that confuses a lot of people who have spent maybe a lot of time in the statically typed languages and then trying to come to the Ruby, which is that in other languages, once you start writing the code, any library that you use, the style will mostly look the same. But with the Ruby, the DSLs being very popular, what happens is everyone can have their own domain-specific languages. That's what the DSL stands for, right? So if you go into the RSpec, it will have its own way of writing the code. Same thing for the routes.rb. Same thing if you configure the gems like the active admin. So understanding what DSLs are and how to build some of the DSLs can reduce so much of confusion and put you a step above when it comes to reading the code. Real time. So we looked at one of the examples wherein we were looking at a bike, and then we talked about the chassis and engine and how all things are coming together there, right? So if I have to find an equivalent of that frame that goes into a bike, it's a rail tie. I wouldn't say that it is 100% correct analogy, because the frames work in the motorcycle is to support all the components. Rails tie here is just a platform wherein everything is coming together to plug in. So in that sense, it's like that frame. Auto-loading, another important framework. So this is the part where I tell all the people who are trying or catching up with the Rails and scaling up themselves is to always compare. Take the components of Rails, take these ideas of Rails, and go to other languages, other frameworks, and see how it is being done there, how it is achieved there. Because these are the learnings, the understandings that make your knowledge, which is something that is framework and language agnostic. So even if you go to something else tomorrow, it's very, very easy to just use those ideas, concepts, and thought processes, learn the new syntax, and you are ready to go in any other languages or be productive in any other languages and frameworks that you want. Yeah? Same applies with the security. That roles provide so much of security features that sometimes you don't appreciate that there is so much there. in terms of routes, I would highly recommend to try out Sinatra and Hanami. Go into the code reading as well to see how it works. And then finally, in the conclusion, I will say this is how now it looks. Dissecting Rails. On one side, there are tools and libraries with some of the basic things like bundler, rake, rack, and then some components of Rails. And then on the ideas on concept side, we have a DSL, security, routing, templating, ORMs, HTTP request and response, and how that particular thing works without even looking into any frameworks. And finally, coming to the Dissecting Rails, what next part? So we have some exercises that you can try and understand as well. It's there on the BetaCraft/Dissecting Rails workshop. You will see there are two exercises. The exercise one is about building a simple rack application, then adding a simple action that checks if the like a speaker is a keynote speaker or not. So getting to something usable. And then there is some exercises about adding the middleware. Then we have some bonus exercises there wherein you can make these middlewares do something useful as well. So very much a step-by-step process. And then there is a second exercise, which is about active record, ERB templating, and action miller. So it just tries to use these three things, right? And this is like a kind of an example wherein you can build a simple Lambda application out of these things, which is responsible for sending the emails. So anytime an event happens, it just looks into your database, creates an email template, and sends it to that user. As simple as that, okay? And as we come to the conclusion, I would like to thank some of the contributors who are also my team members at the BetaCraft: Harun, Matthew, Animesh, and Ankur. So there are some resources. As I was saying, I have some stickers. Meet me after the talk, and thank you.
Questions? Array.42. The curious coder. Who knows what array.42 is for? There you go.
Yeah.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer to the life universe, and everything. Cool.
Okay.
You all have all dissected Rails and got back to Ruby. All right. Thank you, RDDP. Lovely talk. Is everyone wondering when is the coffee break?